Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, which you can also find in the chat window. You will want to view the caption options via a separate window or a separate device. Your audio and video should be turned off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer support. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. We would love for you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit those. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, which you can also find in the link in the chat window. You will want to view the caption options via a separate window or a different device. Your audio and video should be turned off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer support. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, which you can also find in the chat box. You will want to view the captions via a separate window or on a different device. Your audio and video should be off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer you support. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, and you can also find this in the chat window. You will want to view the captions via a separate window or on a different device. Your audio and video should be off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer you support. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions, and we will answer as many as possible. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, which you can also find in the chat window. You will want to view the captions via a separate window or a different device. Your audio and video should be off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer support. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 will begin shortly. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, which you can also find in the link in the chat window. You will want to view the captions via a separate window or a different device. Your audio and video should be off. If you are having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box and a team member will offer you support. There will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Good morning. The Disability Justice, Racial Justice, and the ADA Part 2 is now beginning. Live captioning is available. Please visit the link on your screen, and you can also find the link in the chat window. You will want to view options via a separate window or a different device. Your audio and video should be turned off, please. If you're having technical challenges, indicate so in the chat box, and a team member will offer you support. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We would love for you to submit questions. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to submit your questions. We will answer as many as possible in the allocated time. Next slide, please. Welcome to a conversation focused on disability justice, racial justice, and the ADA, presented by the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. You are in for a robust conversation today. Next slide, please. I'd like to go over our shared agreements. This is a safe space. We respect all efforts to work on accessibility issues in your organization. The fact that you are here is a big deal. We recognize that each organization is at varying levels of accomplishment with accessibility, and we're here to help and not to judge. We are diligent in studying and researching our resources and are interested in learning about those that we may have missed. Next slide, please. My name is Tori Weimer Contreras. I am the Director of Sales and Patron Services at the Seattle Theater Group. I'm also a proud member of the steering committee for the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. My pronouns are she, her. I have long dark brown hair, white skin, and I'm wearing a royal blue top with white flowers. So I'll go over the agenda quickly. There's going to be a welcome. That has already happened. And next up, we will do a land acknowledgement by my colleague at the consortium, Chris Moore with MOPOP. Then Elizabeth Ralston, the founder of the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium, will do an introduction. And then there will be a wonderful panel discussion moderated by consultant Christiana Obey-Sumner. And then at the very end, we will do a Q&A. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can get ready to answer those. And I would like to introduce my colleague on the consortium, Chris Moore. Next slide, please.
Hello, my name is Chris Moore and my pronouns are he, him. I am the exhibits projects coordinator at the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle, and I am also a steering committee member for the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. I have short brown hair, white skin, lots of tattoos, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. Welcome, everyone. We would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we are on. Next slide. I would also like to thank our workshop funder, the Office of Arts and Culture, and our host, Northwest ADA Center, for hosting this workshop and providing interpreters. On the left side of this slide, the logo of the Office of Arts and Culture is a blue capital A with an and symbol, nestled inside a large letter C and the words Office of Arts and Culture Seattle below it. On the right side is the Northwest ADA Center logo with red letters and ADA in white letters with a red background. Thank you again. Now I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Ralston, the founder of the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody, to our wonderful panel discussion. My name is Elizabeth Ralston, and I'm the founder of the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. And our mission is to connect arts and cultural organizations with information and resources to improve accessibility for people of all abilities. And we are fiscally sponsored by Shunpike. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you see Shunpike in red with the word powering the business of art. I use she, her pronouns, and I have gray hair, and am wearing hoops and a pink shirt, and I have white skin. Next slide, please. We work very hard to make these workshops financially accessible and also accessible for people of all abilities. We ask that you consider making a donation to support our mission and future workshops. Together, we can increase accessibility, and you can donate here at bit.ly/SCAC Shunpike. And if you are sending many people from an organization, it is much appreciated that you donate to our organization. I want to talk a little bit about our work at the consortium. What we do is we have three main goals: professional development and training workshops, and accessibility. And we are creating a website with resources which will soon be revealed. And we are in the future hoping to develop an equipment loan program where we hope to one day be able to lend out equipment to arts organizations like assistive listening devices, flat screen TVs for captioning, audio descriptive equipment, and so on. We also provide technical assistance to nonprofits around accessibility planning. And so our hope is to be a community connector where we have to provide workshops for people so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And you can find our workshops from the past on our YouTube channel, which will be posted in the chat. And I'm really excited to now introduce our moderators. So can we have the next slide, please? Actually, first I'm going to go over the goals. Today we are going to hear a perspective from a panel of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color with disabilities, about how disability justice builds on the ADA. We're going to learn how the ADA, while groundbreaking in many ways, has perpetuated harm against BIPOC with disabilities. Again, please be sure to put all your questions and answers, questions in the question and answer box, and we will try to get to as many as we can in this time frame. And now I would like to introduce a wonderful moderator. So next slide, please. Christiana Obey-Sumner is a Black, Indigenous, queer, non-binary, and multiply disabled person. They are the CEO of Epiphanies of Equity, a social equity consulting firm that particularly specializes in social change, intersectionality, anti-racism, and disability justice. For almost 2 decades, they have dedicated their life and career to amplifying the importance of social equity, particularly narrative identity development and its role in cultural humility and allyship, bringing awareness to the lived experience of racialized ableism and externalizing anti-Blackness, and dismantling the psychosocial paradigms that underlie social injustice and inaction. And I know this is a repeat from the last workshop, but I wanted to really stress that I'm so happy that you are here, that you're making the time to come and listen to these really important issues. Our objective is to amplify the voices of BIPOC with disabilities, and this is a wonderful forum to do so. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Christiana on board. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christiana Obey-Sumner. My pronouns are they, them. Thank you for that glowing introduction. I am wearing a black head wrap and a black sweater with black glasses. I am a person with melanated skin that is racialized as Black. I would like to bring on the panelists, if you would turn your screens and microphones on, please. Hello. So what I'm going to ask each of the panelists, one of the panelists will be turning on their screen shortly. What I would like to ask the panelists in about a minute to introduce yourself, what you do, your pronouns, and a brief physical description for captioning. Let's start with Kamiko.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
Okay.
So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well. My name is Kamiko Thomas. I am a Black woman. Today I am wearing glasses because I'm four-eyed. I'm wearing glasses and a red top. I am a writer, filmmaker, and advocate for disabled Black veterans. As a Black female veteran with PTSD, which is an invisible disability. And there is a lot of stigma around not just invisible disabilities, but also around disability itself within the African American community. And the work that I do is to really help to highlight how dangerous some of the stereotypes and myths are surrounding what that looks like and how it navigates through the world. And I've been, I kind of fell into it accidentally. I've been doing this for about 2 years now. And I think it's important work, which is why I keep on trucking, even with, in the middle of the world being on fire. Yeah, so did I cover everything? I think I got everything. Did I? Did I get?
I think
Did I
you
get
did.
it? All right.
Thanks, Kamiko.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Ricky, how about you next?
Hi, my name is Ricky. My pronouns are she, her. I am an African American woman housed in a bigger body. Today I'm wearing a gray shirt and I have my hair up with bangs and like a ponytail at the top. I currently work in affordable housing. I help house the homeless with Plymouth Housing. And then in my spare time, I like to write and I like to talk about different forms of disability justice. I am a person who has physical disabilities, but my main disability that I speak on is my mental disabilities. And I like to talk about how invisible disabilities, especially being Black with an invisible disability, and different intersections, how those impact my life and those like myself. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, as is the tradition in 2020 in these turbulent and virtual times, we have one panelist who will be joining us a little bit shortly because their computer is having some technical difficulties. So they're going to restart and they're going to rejoin. Then we have another panelist that we're not able to connect with them. So we're going to start the panel with Kamiko and Ricky, and then we will have Callisto join us in a little bit. So let's start off with a little bit with some shared definition of things, because a lot of the questions people have is just some of those foundational, like, what does this mean? Or what are these terms? So the first one is, how would you describe disability justice? Hey, it's popcorn style.
Yeah, you know what? I forgot I was on mute. My fault. For me, disability justice, if you're serious about it, when you say disability justice, then you're going to be inclusive, not just of people who have the disabilities that you can see, the ones that, might need walkers or in wheelchairs, or, if they're blind and they have the canes and seeing eye dogs. I think that for true disability justice would encompass the entire spectrum of disability, because I think it's kind of tragic that the only time, like when we think about collectively, when people think about disability, what they're thinking is immediately what they can see. So when I say, as an example, that I'm a disabled, Black veteran, I get these looks like I'm somehow not telling the truth about it, and that kind of causes a little spiral for me, because now I feel like I have to convince someone that I'm not lying, and I shouldn't have to do that. So for me, I think disability justice, if we're serious about it, encompasses an entire spectrum of what that means, from those who are hearing impaired to, like I said, from, people with, mental health issues, concerns. I hate that, issues, concerns. Yeah, that's my perspective.
And I would piggyback off of that and say that that is so important. I think another part of disability justice that's overlooked is talking about the intersections of race and also physical body type. So talking about people who might be in bigger bodies or even those who are in smaller bodies, and understanding the impact of how being Black with a mental disorder or a physical disability is going to be completely different than someone who is not Black. And so I think when you're talking about disability justice, it's about recognizing that all disabilities manifest in different ways for different people, and that unfortunately how society chooses and categorizes people also has a major impact on that. As someone who has a mental and I think also with that, talking about the ability levels of different people. So I'll give my own personal experience as someone who lives with bipolar disorder. There's a stereotype of that, like I go from like sad to like crazy, like to throwing things. And also recognizing that just because today I'm fine and I can work doesn't mean that tomorrow is going to be the same. And understanding that there are some people even on those spectrums that can have, with good interventions, can have months and months and years with no symptoms, whereas other people, that doesn't work for them. And so knowing that it manifests differently in people, and especially with the invisible disabilities, which I don't think are necessarily invisible, but what we call invisible, meaning that we just show grace. And when someone says, this is what I live with, you don't need to question that they live with it just because you don't see it how you think it should be seen.
Thank you for those answers. I just want to acknowledge that Callisto has been able to join us, and so I want to give him some time, Callisto, for 60 seconds or so, a minute, to share, a little bit about who you are, your background, naming your pronouns into the space, and a brief physical description for captioning.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Callisto, affectionately known as Listo, which is ready in Spanish, Zenda Nanan. My pronouns are he, this third gender pronoun Z and they. I reside in SeaTac, Washington, and I am multiply disabled on the autism spectrum, as well as chronically fatigued. I am a death guide and worker that formerly worked in Seattle's nonprofit community. I am a survivor of multiple suicide attempts, and I'm a transracial adoptee. I popped back in because I wanted the lighting to be right. And when I got the lighting right, my video wasn't showing for y'all. And jumping right in at this time, what Ricky was saying and what everybody else on this panel was saying when I came in, I can speak to that experience of being differently interpreted. Not everybody is the same. And after my experience with wanting death and now helping guide people who have a choice in their death, I started seeing therapy, which I hadn't really thought of doing as a Black man before, because I thought it wasn't the right thing to do. I was like, I can handle this all myself. I bottled it up inside, didn't know anybody could interpret me correctly. And I've had friends that say, oh, I've seen therapists long enough, I don't need to see them anymore. And that doesn't work for me. I have to see somebody and talk to them outside of my family and my relationship. Otherwise things kind of fall out of control. And last year, once I was becoming more of an advocate for myself and less of one who was just trying to prove myself. I don't like to prove myself anymore. It just drags me down and causes my depression to worsen. Just realizing that advocacy presents itself in many different ways. And the hardest thing I've had to grapple with in the last month or so has been that when we ask for things that support the ADA, when we ask for things, it's not wrong to ask, and it's not a burden, and it's not asking too much. But when I've told people I need this accommodation at work, I'm told that, oh, that's fake. And it isn't fake to ask for a service animal to come to work with you. And it isn't fake to ask for interpreters to be able to understand better and to have closed captioning because I can't hear as well or I can't see as well as the next person. And it's not inappropriate to ask for a regular lunch break. Those are just things that I need in my own life as a person with multiple disabilities. And there are the rare few people that do understand what we need without saying you're asking too much. But thank you for having me here today.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think it also is a great segue, as you were talking about sort of the different sort of ways disability justice happen. I think about the first one, which is intersectionality. I think some people think intersectionality, disability plus, but I feel like in my case, for example, intersectionality means being multiply disabled. I was born autistic with some other chronic disabilities. The disability that leads me to use an assistive device is something that came out of medical racism. Not to mention that the ways that my psychiatric disability not only presents, but the way that I've had to digest and have that be a part of my experience was also rooted in this experience of racism. As I started talking about disability, the psychiatric disability advocacy, I've been more open to talk about the ones that people perhaps are a little bit more open to digesting, like depression, anxiety, PTSD, to a certain degree schizoaffective. But the last few months during this pandemic, what I've really been trying to digest is this dissociative identity disorder, which I've had my entire life. But I think it's one of those things that people don't hold that. So it's been really difficult of how do I explain in a space where I want to center and hold, my Blackness and my experience and these sort of things that require a rootedness within a vessel when I feel like a system that is sort of in a space that doesn't feel like it fits in this plane of existence. Anyway, the point of this is a lot of these sort of mindsets and viewpoints around these sort of transcendental things come from indigenous spirituality as I read more about it back in Africa and Afro-Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora. But then when we're in this society, then what we may have seen ancestrally as a gift or just a way of life is seen as a disorder. So it makes me think about how do we bring anti-racism into this, which leads us to the next question of definition of things. What does anti-racism mean? How would you define anti-racism? And how would you define anti-racism too with this lens of the difference between equity and equality?
Is it anybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll go.
Anyone?
So I think when it comes to anti-racism, I think the biggest part is recognizing that racism is real, and understanding that racism, just like when we're talking about disability justice, racism looks like very different things. I think in the Pacific Northwest, it's very easy for people to try to separate themselves. Like, we're not like the Southern racists. We don't burn crosses. But that passive aggressiveness and the microaggressions are just as harmful. And in my case, I would say even more harmful, because I personally would prefer to know that you hate me so I can just move along, versus someone who's going to pretend to like you. So I think that the Pacific Northwest niceness without the acknowledgement, something I like to remind people is that the Pacific Northwest was actually made as a white supremacist haven. I like to remind people that, as much as we try to liberalize ourselves, we also have to acknowledge the history of where we live. And I think that's crucial in anti-racism work. I think that a huge part of anti-racism work is also acknowledging your own, not only your organization, but your own personal biases and everything like that, and holding space to say, I used to be like that, but I am dedicated to changing. Because we get it. Like, if you don't know, then you might not know. But if someone is telling you what you're doing or what you're saying or how you're behaving, or if I tell you that the reason you're treating me this way is because I'm Black, you have to understand, like, I'm not making that up. I didn't just pull that from the sky. And then by the time we call people on our experience, it's probably like the 1,000th time that we've experienced that. And so I think a huge part of anti-racism work is listening to those BIPOC voices, hearing what they're saying, challenging your own behavior, your own beliefs, and then being okay with knowing that you have work to do, knowing that you're perfect, and knowing that you're never going to be perfect at this because you don't live those experiences. But I think the hugest part is listening to, without trying to gaslight or overlook, the BIPOC experience. If a BIPOC person is telling you this is their experience, then you should listen to them. And you should also kind of take that as, this person probably cares about you and wants you to do better, because most of us, in my experience, if we think it's hopeless, we just move along and we just go and we process that with with other people that look like us that can understand. So if people are calling you on that, I think you should listen to it. And I think especially if you're working in any organization that comes in contact with people who experience trauma at the hands of these oppressive systems. So if you're working in criminal justice, if you're working in housing, if you're working with the military, if you're working with any of those systems that have historic, racist tendencies, or medicine or anything like that, really listening to that, because we're also trying to reduce harm that other people like us are going to experience because we've probably experienced it ourselves.
Thank you.
For me, it's interesting, Ricky, that you talked about, the so-called difference between Southern racism and Northern racism, because I moved up here from the South. I was born in Confederate Memorial Hospital. Okay, just to give you a little bit of context with that, and I come here and I hear everyone talking about Seattle's progressive and it's liberal and we love everybody. And one thing I notice is that you love everybody as long as everyone is willing to put themselves into your blender and just erase their own cultural specificities and their identities to be part of this grand ideal that the people who are perpetuating this don't even believe in themselves, because you can tell by the way that they behave. So I feel that if you're talking about, anti-racism, number one, I mean, I know people feel a little skittish about saying this. You have to address the fact that within communities of color, there is an extreme amount of anti-Blackness. So then you have, as an example, I was part of a invisible disability panel. Was that last year? I think, last year, where there was an Indian woman who straight up said, "How do we know you're not faking?" And this is a panel of disabled people of color right? And she felt very, 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 very comfortable saying that. So I know that she's coming from the perspective of the stereotype of all Black people want to do is steal. We're lazy. We don't want to do this and we don't want to do that. And so now we're going to try to use the ADA, which honestly hasn't really benefited me a whole lot. Now we're trying to use the ADA to get 15 extra minutes at lunch, or to get accommodations that you half-ass want to give anyway. Like, come on, that's a lot to go through for the very, very little that's given in return. And if we're going to talk about anti-racism, we have to talk about the fact that there are Chinese anti-Black people, there are Japanese anti-Black people, there are Indian anti-Black people, and yes, they might be taking their cues from white supremacy, but it doesn't change the fact that in helping that system create more harm, they are using their perceived proximity to whiteness to bolster their position, while also keeping a foot on the necks of people with a darker hue. And if we're going to have a conversation about anti-racism, anti-Blackness is a huge thing. You see it with the protests. Even with that, people are still trying to make this about, what did she do and what did he do, and it's, oh, they're burning down the Target. Target is a billion-dollar corporation. They will be fine if they're missing a few pairs of jeans. I know people who worked at Target, white people would walk in there and rob that store blind every day, and you didn't have anything to say about that. So why is it that now you want to make the narrative about the looting and not about, here's another Black person who was murdered by a cop for no reason, another Black woman who was murdered for no reason, and that's not your concern. Your concern all of a sudden is the destruction of property when you couldn't care less about it before.
And I think saying that, because I will also share in a Q&A, someone had asked, where does mental illness fit into this? And as we're talking, about disability justice, and so one of the things, we'll have a short break at 10:40, and I want to make sure Listo can respond to this question too. I wanted to give a really brief history of, when we're talking about disability justice, we're talking about 10 principles, right? And I think that was sent out with the invite to this event, that a link to talk about the 10 principles from Sins Invalid. But I think if I can remember as many of them, I might not remember all 10. I think it was leadership of those most impacted, intersectionality, anti-capitalist politic, sustainability, recognizing wholeness, collective liberation, collective access, cross-movement solidarity, cross-disability solidarity, and there's always one that I forget. But the thing about this is that there's so much of this that has been infused through this. First of all, mental illness as disability, or psychiatric disability as a disability towards the Black and brown body in this country, has been happening since this country. In the past, especially as people started to move towards desegregation, originally pre and during the emancipation and the Reconstruction period, which was 10 years after the emancipation, and then what they call the Great Nadir. So after the failed Reconstruction period to the Civil Rights Act. So we're talking about end of 1800s to 1964. Throughout that period, the use of psychiatric disabilities as a diagnosis, I think it was collective liberation. Someone talked to things. The use of disability as a diagnosis was weaponized against all people who were not constructed as white, whiteness itself being a construct. I grew up in Philly. People in Philly, when we talked about race, they would be white and Italian, Irish Catholic, German Lutheran, Greek. And so we're going to talk about, say, work requirements for food stamps. we could talk about that in terms of its racism and anti-Blackness. We could also make a connection to the potato famine and the fact that England also forced the Irish work requirements to get their food, which is why they ended up all dying in the street and fleeing to the United States. There was some connections there that, as I moved to the West Coast, those sort of connections were not as rooted here. So even if you go into this history, which I feel like is a whole different training, but if you go into the history, even to this day, it's still been happening. But I think as we see the CIA start to declassify some files, they started to admit about things like the Black Panther Party, if they couldn't be charged on crimes when they were arrested in court, they were then diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, and a lot of them died in psychiatric institutions. All the way back to in the past when people were trying to be liberated in the North, the enslaved people, as they were being emancipated, then they would then be diagnosed with something like drapetomania. Drapetomania was a diagnosis of a mental disorder of people who desire to be free and not be enslaved. That is why psychiatric disability fits into the disability justice conversation, because as we come into the 21st century, some 30 years after the ADA, we're still facing a lot of these issues. And so when there is a whole conversation around the school to prison / school to institutionalization pipeline, that institutionalization not just being prisons, also being psychiatric institutions, medical institutions, and social institutions that can have the same sort of vortex effect. With that description, I wanted to give Listo some, if you wanted to talk on that or some last words, and then we're going to have a brief 2-minute break and come back to chat about some more questions.
Going back to that last question, the thing that just kept on coming to my mind was the intersectionality and realizing that when it comes to race and disability, just in like the past week or two, when I was talking about accommodations that I was looking for at work, and it seems that I didn't have to, I didn't take it there when a person from a generation pretty similar to ours, not boomer or far off in the distant future, but they brought up a point that me asking for accommodations, whether that be, can I not cover my tattoos at work? Can I keep a piercing in my nose? And some of these, my mentor has told me, are cultural ways of expressing oneself at work. Yet other people bring out their racism and say, no, you have to be as conservative as capitalism makes it. And in this discussion, it turned to the same people that ask to uncover their tattoos and wear piercings at work and have headphones on because of ADHD, anxiety, autism, are the same people who will ask for a support animal. And I said, why are you equating all of these accommodations with both culture and religion and faith, as well as ADA, and intersecting them, and then saying that's wrong to ask for that when they were of one of the religions, be that Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, and I'm not going to disclose for their own anonymity, but it showed that I was out there, putting myself out there as a Black disabled person, asking for these accommodations and hoping for support from people in the community that I work in, only to have somebody who has these cultural differences that are also marginalized and discriminated against. And I didn't even go there. And then other people went there and said, well, aren't you a religious zealot? And I was like, you didn't need to go there, but we need to come up with an equal medium so that we're not putting racism at that same realm of asking for accessibility practices. Because there might not be a right answer, and there still is a lot of work to be done around that. And I've seen that growing up in a small rural community where I was one of maybe 10 Black kids in my community and I was adopted. So that was another thing where people are like, why are you a different skin color than your sibling? Could God have made you different? Because there was a lot of religious people in my neighborhood. And I had a privilege of really, I don't know if it was a privilege or just me kind of caping, because it took me until almost 30 years old to get a diagnosis because of how assumed females at birth are perceived by the medical system when it comes to being diagnosed with autism. And I digress, but those are just different barriers I've navigated and different things that I've seen, when otherwise I could have just been complacent and not heard it. But now I've been more aware of what I'm hearing around me, and having been in the South and realizing there's a different type of racism down there and our communities support each other, and then coming out here and realizing there is a smaller community where we support one another, but the racism is buried under them trying to find a way of understanding but still not understanding.
Thank you for that, Listo. That's a good note to go to. So we're going to take a quick 2-minute break just to kind of process and digest. We're going to come back. We're going to answer a couple more questions. We'll talk about a couple more questions, and then we'll start some question and answer portions of that. So 10:45, so I guess 10:47, we'll be back. Okay, I'm back. I was having technical issues, but I'm back now. Hello. So we have 10, 15 minutes until the Q&A section, but you know what? We have a lot of great Q&As in here.
Yeah.
I want to share, there's some of these that I just want to share that as people have put some statements in the Q&A. Someone had said, I think to Listo, thank you for addressing, as someone living with multiple actual mental illnesses and as a man of color, I've always hidden this and played off when I'm experiencing low swings in the professional setting. You know, one of the things that I always talk about in my trainings when we talk about social construction is think about, when I say the word professional, what comes up for you? And more often than not in these trainings, people are like, oh, white person with a suit and a briefcase. So there's also all these loaded pieces too, right? Around like, it means degreed white collar job and in certain ways that you're going to talk and present yourself and all these constructs that if we talk about unconscious bias, which means that we're not thinking about what we're thinking, that's what comes up. Some of these are, and we'll get to some of the questions. I wanted to ask y'all a couple other questions before we get to some of the Q&A. The first thing is I want to talk about racialized ableism, which racialized ableism is, for folks who don't know this term, is the intersectional experience of racism and ableism. And you know, and all of the things racism entails, so anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, anti-indigeneity, things like that. I want to ask y'all, how does this show up in our institutions, systems, and society, and or at the intersection of an insurrection and pandemic, given racialized ableism right now? What should folks be aware of or doing?
So I can think of the number one thing I thought of when you said that is the fact that to get any, especially someone, so what people don't know, and I do this in my work, we work with reasonable accommodation. So if someone comes in a wheelchair, we can technically skip having to get a provider to verify their disability. If you have a mental illness, you have to see a doctor and they have to do that. And I think when we talk about the ADA in the workplace, I think of my experience at a former job in which HR was one person. This one person now knew my whole mental health history because I had to provide, well, they didn't know all of my mental health history, but they knew my diagnosis. And they were able to use that diagnosis to do things like gaslight me in the workplace and do other things to make me, or make things about my mental illness that were actually about them being racist. So I think one of the things when we talk about racialized ableism is the fact that to prove your disability, especially for Black people, you have to then make them go through the medical system, which we know is historically and currently racist. So there's that. And then the fact that, like I said before, disabilities manifest in everyone differently, and how it also shows up racially is going to be different. That is, you know, like I, as an African-American person, am aware that I couldn't have like this crazy mood swing in public and throw a chair if I wanted to, because that would be criminalized. They wouldn't think, oh, she, you know, has bipolar disorder and maybe she's having a meltdown. It would be, she's violent. So I think that when we talk about racialized ableism, a huge part is how it manifests and how it forces Black people especially to, before they can even, like, they have to start second guessing their own mental illness or their own disability first, and they have to think about themselves as a racial person versus as a person who might be suffering. So I think about, if you're going to ask for help as someone with a mental illness or something like that, you have to think, I can't go in there frantic. I need to go in there and I need to be able to advocate for myself, and I need to be able to endure the stress, and I need to be able to convey my message. And then you also deal with the fact that if you go in there, you might be in the middle of a psychotic episode, but you might also look like you're coping too well. And people don't really talk about that, how, especially with mental illness, there's this perception of how it should look. And if you don't look it, or if you're able to advocate for yourself well, because culture says that we need to advocate for ourselves well to be able to get the help that we need, how you'll also be rejected resources. Social Security is the number one proponent of that. If you are going for Social Security because, you know, disability because of a mental illness, how very much so if you advocate for yourself too well, then they'll say, oh, well, you know, you can work. Or you don't look like you're, you know, in the middle of a psychotic episode. You don't look like you're disabled, and how all of that has to do with, a lot of it has to do, most of it has to do with race, because I also have been around people who are not Black, who have disclosed all of their mental illnesses, and no one has ever second guessed them, not once. But if I say I'm bipolar, you know, they're like, oh, well, you're coping so well, you're doing so great. And it's like, yeah, thank you to 16 years worth of fighting for myself and dealing with the ups and downs and dealing with all these systems. But I would go back to, I think that the number one point of like racialized ableism comes from the start of getting a diagnosis and having to deal with a very racist medical system who either wants to overdiagnose you or underdiagnose you. And it's wild on the things that they're willing to diagnose. Like, you know, they'll diagnose any of those ones that can make it where you might be able to be criminalized. But if you think of things like autism, the rate of the amount of Black people who are given like an oppositional defiance disorder versus an autism diagnosis are like, it's staggering. So it's also just, I think it's wild when we look at what they're willing to diagnose Black people with, and how those diagnoses are also very linked to how they can be criminalized, especially for children, how they can be criminalized, how they can be, how they can lead to that school to prison pipeline versus the diagnoses that they should be given, that would open up resources for them and allow them to get the help that they need. And even if they get that diagnosis, being able to go and find supportive systems is nearly impossible. Sorry, I went long on that.
You know,
Thanks, Ricky.
I think one thing that we don't really talk about enough when we talk about racialized ableism is the internalized racism and ableism, because on the one hand, it's okay, I have post-traumatic stress disorder with secondary major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So my stuff can look like bipolar disorder. It can look like so many different things, because a lot of these disorders have symptom overlap. It's like a little Venn diagram of stuff. So on the one hand, I'll have, because I've actually had this happen since being in Seattle, I have had Black people who, if they knew about my disorder, immediately wanted to make everything that they did that was foul about, it's my mental health issue that's the reason that I'm having this problem, not you stole money from my business. And anyone would have a problem with that. Not you just undermine my humanity in a way that I would never undermine yours. And of course I have an issue with that. No, it's, oh, you only have this problem because of the PTSD, right? Then the other one is if they know about it and then you do something they don't like, which is saying, look, I don't believe in putting my mental health in toxic situations, then it's, oh, I've been called a crazy bitch. Like, I have been called a crazy bitch by people who were well aware of my mental health diagnosis. And I'm thinking, okay, that shouldn't be a hate crime, but another conversation for another day, but maybe. So I feel that we've got to, so this racialized ableism goes to, and then the other layer is, as a Black woman, Black women are so strong. We got to uplift everyone. We got to be everybody's backbone. We have to be everyone's support system. So it's, well, you can't crumble, because if you crumble, then I can't put my burdens on your back. And it's like, dude, I have my own stuff. that I'm dealing with, I don't need you to say strong Black woman. So now I have to sit here and hide. And I did this for almost 20 years. And I've been dealing with PTSD for 22 years. So think about this. So for most of the time that I've been dealing with this, I have been hiding it because God forbid anyone knew, right? And then God forbid that they knew. And then it's like, I'm not representing the strength and resilience of Black women well. I'm not representing the culture well, because mental health issues are for white people, and therapy and medication and all these things are for white people. Like, you are the descendants of the enslaved. You should just be able to just suck it up and deal with it. And I tried that for 15 years to suck it up and deal with it, and ended up dealing with 3 suicide attempts as a result of that. So then I say, you know what, I'm not doing that anymore. And anyone that has a problem with that, they can't be in my space, because it's harmful to the work that I am doing to center and heal myself. So racialized ableism in the context of white supremacy, of course, is, you know, the anger that comes from PTSD being, oh, you're just an angry Black woman, not the mood swings that come from PTSD, not the grace we give to televised white people suffering from PTSD. With me, it's, oh, I just have an attitude, because Black women have attitudes anyway. And so I'm catching it from white people, and I'm catching it from Black people. It's like,
Yeah.
Can't win for losing.
Right. Thank you, Kamiko. I wanted to give Listo some time, and then I'm going to ask another question and have some brief answers to that question, so we can get to the Q&A questions, because we are 20 minutes out. I want to make sure we have time for the Q&A section. Listo, do you have any thoughts on this question before we go to the next one?
I was initially thinking of going second, but I feel that Kamiko's dialogue led to what exactly I was thinking, because I've lived in Seattle for 6 years. I moved here from Missoula, Montana, where I lived for 5 years, and before that, Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm originally from Chicago. And the thought was, like, growing up, I had gone to a specialized school since I was homeschooled from about the age of 4 until about halfway through pre-kindergarten. Pre-kindergarten wasn't working for me, so my parents enrolled me in a school called Spectrum. And most of the folks there were also autistic, but my parents had never sought out a formal diagnosis. My parents are both very academic, and they had journals upon journals of stories about how I grew up and how I had exhibited autism. And then my multiple disabilities started impacting my work. So I sought a formal diagnosis, and thankfully my parents had those journals to back up the diagnoses with the 3 specialists that I went through. But in my work prior to that, I was just working and being like, maybe I'm not, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. And then when I finally got the diagnoses, it was used against me in a way, saying, well, maybe you couldn't judge that person's facial expression because you're autistic. And I'm like, is that because you read the book that said this is what autistic people are like? Because I can read their facial expression to a degree. And even a person that isn't autistic doesn't have to play a game of guessing someone's gender identity, their sexuality, etc. And that, I guess, I was going through the Q&A questions, kind of plays to what one would want from the workplace. And that is when it that we're not one another's counselors, and just because we may know something about a diagnosis doesn't mean that we can speak to it. We can be open-minded about it, but not tell somebody how to behave around that. And it's come from both Black and white sides. I have been in several leadership groups and consider myself a leader in the community. it's difficult to be my own advocate. And looking back to how things present themselves in the most unexpected ways, especially one's anger. The other day I was unloading a moving van and my partner was like, "You're having an OCD moment right now." And I was like, maybe I am, but you don't need to call it that, and don't need to make me more aware of it happening. But it circles back with many of us unemployed by coronavirus or who are changing our careers because of one mean or another. It might be because of the pandemic, and it might be I didn't particularly like the career field I was in and felt more called to another. And just navigating these job interviews and thinking about how to enter it from a disability justice point of view, where the ADA hasn't done much good for me. But that question that nibbles at the back of my head that I fear the most is, so how do you handle things under pressure? And when things become pressurized for me, then I'm not medicated for my OCD, but I am medicated for my anxiety and depression. And I feel that employers could advocate for people who are ADHD, OCD, bipolar, autistic, by realizing that, hey, if somebody has decided to spend 5 hours writing an employee handbook, or a person has decided to take their anxiety and channel that into doing the dishes in the company kitchen, that's completely normal, instead of saying, well, you shouldn't have spent 5 hours on that book, it wasn't part of your job. Broadening what someone's job description entails. And as long as the work is done at the end of the day, then that person can feel affirmed and not called out in the workplace.
I think that's a perfect segue to the final question. And then I really want, and so what I'm going to ask is I'm going to ask y'all this question, and I'm going to ask y'all, for sake of time, to give me perhaps a bulleted list of what you think can be done. So this question, because the last question I wanted to ask is, we're witnessing this moment at the intersection of the pandemic and the insurrection, where there's been several letters and calls for racial justice in the arts. And there's a lot of arts leaders on this call. And I'm sure that, I want to say to folks who are still on this call, what you're hearing a lot of this is, and the difference between this panel, I believe, and the first panel, is that there are very rarely spaces for BIPOC people, especially Black folks, to just talk openly about disability. So there's a lot we got to say. And so I'm hoping that this is something that is that people are taking and they are applying this to what they need. What would you say to the arts leaders on this call? Maybe like your top 3 things that they can do to infuse disability justice at the intersection of racial justice, in addition to these letters. And then we'll get into some of the Q&A questions. I know each of you here are artists too, so you can also speak from the perspective of like trying to enter into the arts, because I know like.
I would say for me, as a writer, I don't feel like there are a lot of spaces for me to write about my disability. It seems like it's all about fiction and fun, which is great, but there's a lot of real stuff that's going on right now, and I don't think that's being addressed. So I would say, first off, there should be a very specific space within the arts community for people who are dealing with disabilities, no matter what they are, and that there should also be more opportunities created specifically for people like me, because my competing with others for the same kind of grant money, and then it's the same people who get picked for grants and fellowships and things of that nature. I mean, like, I already know what that's about. So those are the only 2 things I can think of, that come to the top of my mind. Or the third one would be, look, I don't need you asking me a million questions about something that when I already told you what it is. Like, this is the sum total of my experience. So if I'm telling you this is what it is, it's what it is, and let's move forward from there. I don't need your selective interpretation of an experience that's not yours.
I would say my top three would be going off what Kimiko was saying, like, I think you need to be specific. So I think you need to ask for Black disabled folks. And with that, I think also asking for maybe one who's physically disabled and one who might be have like a mental disability, because those are two completely different experiences.
Yeah.
I think the second one would be hiring Black disabled people. And being specific and being intentional about that, because I think as a Black disabled person, when I go to these spaces, I want to see people like me, and not, you can't see everything like that, but especially seeing other Black people, especially in a place like Seattle where it's not very Black. So being intentional and hiring that. And then I would say the third thing would be really look in depth at both your employee policies and your like public policies, and having someone who lives those experiences go through and point out to you all of the ableism. Because I think that, you know, trying to have people who are able-bodied and able-minded looking at these, they're not going to know that, not providing, sound muting, like headphones at a gallery can be really triggering to people who, for a variety of different reasons, they can get overwhelmed, they can do all those things, not having quiet spaces. So different things like that. So I think those would be my top three.
Thinking on it, I probably have a lot more than top three, but with a background as a prior to what I do now, my associates is in fine arts. I'm an actor, a dancer, a multidisciplinary artist. And I think that the first thing I'd say is that realizing that artists have had to have multiple means of survival. So when it comes to looking at one's portfolio, looking at it from these multiple points of view. So a person may have been in 4 plays, may have drawn 12 pieces, and may have been on podcasts or something along those lines. When it's narrowed down to, I'm looking for an actor, and that actor or actress has had to have 18 years of experience, then that kind of narrows it down. And for artists with anxiety, depression, and gaps in their employment because they've had to do things outside of the arts to survive, then it's like, how do I put my foot back into the arts community? I'd also say coming up with accessible ways for folks in film, video, music to show their talents. One thing that I can speak upon is that I read sheet music. And when it comes to rote memorization, it's something that I'm learning to practice now because I don't have a choice in the matter about memorizing stuff for the national boards for law and funeral directing. But when it comes to playing the guitar and saxophone, I have to have that music in front of me. And I was most supported when I was in Black Dick Matters last year, when I was able to memorize 2 parts of the act, but they let me read from my journal. And that added to the piece without taking away from it, but allowed access so that I wouldn't be like, dang, I forgot my lines. And lastly, I would say that there's several venues in the city that I'd recommend or model upon, like the scent-free, ADA accessible, small venue. You could have the headphones that we're speaking about in galleries. I've spent tons of times in galleries in art school, but places like Gay City, more places like that, where people can bring their wheelchair in, not worry about being bombarded by scent, and have a way of having a sign language interpreter or closed captioning. Because one of my worst art experiences I can think about was before I had glasses, and I was in 6th grade trying to read the English translations from a Greek opera in Chicago, and I could not see the screen. So I did not know what was going on aside from very muted tones of some form of act. So those are my three things: making it visually and sensory accommodating for viewers, making it accessible for your actors to not have to memorize, and making it more accessible for people who are new or coming back into the arts world to not have anxiety or depression around how to get back into this arts world when so many of us are unemployed.
Thank you for that. I mean, and we're gonna go to the Q&A in a second. I was gonna say that my top three, because I think it's really important. Seniority clauses in unions. Yes, it's, if you have a union that has lasted longer than 30 years, you're definitely going to have more people with seniority who are not going to be Black and or disabled, but likely not Black and disabled. So if they're the ones who are always going to be able to get picked first for roles and gigs, you're going to be categorically leaving out people who would have only been able to have access recently. Second, moving from colorblind to color conscious casting, there's absolutely no reason why you should have a script that requires people who are going to be representing certain cultures and experiences where you cannot find those people. I understand that there's some wonky laws around that, but all of those laws are able to be interpreted in order to have those roles, and you do not need to have required clauses like the Gershwin clause for Porgy and Bess in order to ensure to have an all Black cast. And third of all, I think what's really important for folks to think about is the ways in which you allow accommodations or you create pipelines in order for there to be more people to bring into your theater or your art house. I think that also includes looking at the classism of requiring a curator or an agent or a fine arts degree, MFA, BFA, or that you are so-called doing things in a classical way. So as Lista was talking about, if you have a scene that can allow someone to read from a prop, allow that sort of accommodation, which leads us to, for time, I'm going to have some themes. So there's a huge theme in the question and answer around how to offer accommodations. Some people ask how to offer accommodations in a way that goes above and beyond the ADA. Some people ask for accommodations in ways that people can be allies or accomplices to you. Some people ask, how do you have accommodations in ways that you can be able to bring your whole self without having to disclose the disability or the accommodation that you need? What are some of the suggestions you would give to the people asking about this? I know, good question.
Oh my goodness. For me, what I realized when I kept getting fired from jobs because I, number one, don't have the energetic resources to work a 9 to 5. And, with my triggers being what they are, what doesn't always make me the best coworker, I realized that I needed to just start my own business, because that way I can work where I work best. And as long as the work gets done, it's not like anyone's going to ask me, did you write this at 3 o'clock in the morning? Like, dude, you got it by the deadline. It doesn't matter. Right. So I've actually, and this is what Ricky and Lisa have both said, I've had to just be my own advocate and really just study myself and think about what I need in the moment, and also sometimes think about what I wish someone had been able to give to me, and just figure out a way to give it to myself. It's not always easy, because I still find myself in a position where if I hit one of those spirals and I can't do anything, I'm still not comfortable talking about why I need an accommodation. It's like, because I feel like it might be a different person that I'm having that conversation with, but it's the same conversation. So sometimes I feel like I say it so much, I'm sick of hearing it. And then I project that onto other people. So then I don't tell them what I need. So I end up not getting what I need. And then it's like a feedback loop. So it's still a work in progress for me. But I will say that for what I did was just understanding, again, I don't think the ADA, as great as it is for a lot of people, I don't think the ADA was really written for people like me and mine. So I kind of look at it like it's there, but it's not there. So I just kind of do what I need to do. And I have my diagnosis, like when I need to like provide documentation, but outside of that, I just kind of, I've been winging it actually. Yeah.
I was given a 5-minute warning, so I'm giving y'all the 5-minute warning too.
Okay.
I would say, one, if you are an employer and you're not providing benefits to your employees, then you don't get to ask them to bring documentation to you to prove their disability, because if you're not providing them with the health insurance that they need to go see a doctor to get the documentation, then you don't get to require that. I think another thing is, I don't think we don't talk about how the ADA, employers use the ADA as like a liability coverage for themselves. Like, oh, we can't provide that accommodation without documentation because liability. It's like, if I'm coming to you and it's a very little thing that you can have the flexibility to change, if it's a schedule thing, if it's something like that, why do I need to go through trying to wait to see my doctor to get the documentation? And then you give all these deadlines and different things like that. So I think that there are ways that employees can ask for things, and that's also being able to bring your full self. I think if someone comes to you and says, hey, so I can't really start at 7, but can I start at 8:30? Like, that's easier for me to do. Then I think that should be something that you say, okay, hey, that's great. If that can work between everyone. So I think allowing people that space first and listening to them. And I also think that additionally, when people start asking for accommodations, like this idea that it also needs to be able to suit the business's needs, like, me being employed by you is me suiting the business needs, and my accommodations are going to make me a better employee. So, and I think the first thing that people have to do to get over that is like take everything out of your mind about what you think an accommodation should look like for somebody and for what their disability is, and just listen to what they're saying they need. Because as someone who's disabled, I promise you, we're not asking for anything above or beyond what we actually need. And we're probably not even actually asking for what we actually need. We're asking for something that we know will get approved. So I think once you get that out of your mind of what an accommodation is, and you start listening to the people who are living those experiences, that's where you're gonna get your most progress.
Thank you. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yeah. I don't know how I got muted, but I agree on those lines too. I didn't mention earlier, but I call myself a disabled workaholic. It's like if I were to fill out to try and get disability and be limited to 24 or less hours of work a week, I would feel like I'd kind of lost a sense of myself. So I come up with my own accommodations to still work a 40 to 50 hour week, because I feel that's how I'm useful. And I know that's just how I feel about myself. But I appreciate what Ricky said, and I think that I'm seeing that as a boundary of, hey, I do not have to show my paperwork and of my diagnoses unless you're offering to help with this healthcare coverage. Because being unemployed during the pandemic has allowed me a little bit more conscientious thought of not just taking any work that falls into my lap. Because if I walk into a place initially, as a trans person with disabilities, I can say, I need healthcare because of these two things in my life. And just providing that general advocacy about how that would look, and bringing one's whole self. It's not, there are certain things that might seem over the top to ask for, but asking for 2 hours of trauma stewardship worked into a 40-hour week, so you're working 38 hours but still being paid for the 40 so that you can take some self-care rest time out of the week, or asking to come in an hour later because your arthritis or Crohn's is acting up, is something that workplaces can do and should support, because speaking from a death professional funeral director's perspective, if we aren't supporting our employees living, then the employee might die, and we don't want that. So supporting and well, in less dark forms of speaking, I suppose I could say, if an employee is not supported in the work that they do, then you have less of an opportunity to retain that employee.
Thank you. I'm excited. I'm so thankful that y'all are here today and we were able to have this conversation. For the people who are watching this, I put in the chat, there's a couple of questions in here, which I honestly feel like, and I'm open to y'all if you want to, that I really feel like are their own panel discussions themselves. Its own panel, and a lot of that is talking about in the chat. Things like, what are some characteristics of white supremacy culture? What's the best way to elevate voices of disabled folks? How can disabled white folks support centering BIPOC's disabled lived experience? What strategies do you use to interrupt white supremacy? There's a lot of that I put in the chat. At the Disability Visibility Project, which is an organization that's led by Alice Wong. They had 30 people, I believe, BIPOC, who are disabled, who wrote essays on these very topics. Someone also talked about resources, of which I can, here's the thing about me, you asked me about resources during the break, I got this pile of resources to talk about racialized ableism and the history of racialized ableism, and I have this pile of books that could talk about how you can institute that into your business and try to learn about how to be allies and accomplices in this work. I will write this out and I will send this to you as a resource, as well as a larger resource document that I have created and I keep up about the intersection of racism and ableism. It will have some people to follow, including the people here, if they so inclined. It will also have articles, videos, book recommendations, as well as reflection questions, including reflection questions if you're interested in watching certain movies or documentaries about the history of things. If I would start with Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington, which talks about the history of Blackness being pathologized, as well as Stamped from the Beginning, which is by Ibram X. Kendi. It is a tome, but I would suggest it because it is, as aptly named in the subtitle, The Definitive History of Racial Ideas in America, and many more that I will send here to read. So with that, we're out of time. And I also want to amplify in the question and answer that askjan.org is a good resource to talk about accommodations for things. I would also compare and contrast websites like AskJan with things like the ADA 30 in color, just to ensure that there is that aspect of anti-racism and disability justice in the accommodation suggestions. And that's all I have. I think we're out of time.
Thank you so much, Christiana. Wow, this was such a rich conversation with all of you panelists. Thank you for your time. And I want to say that as someone with an invisible disability, I'm deaf and I'm also white. I am acutely aware of the privilege that I hold, and I am doing whatever I can to be an ally. So I'm learning so much from all of you, and thank you for taking the time and the space to be here with us. I would like all of us to, be curious and speak up if you see something that doesn't sit quite right with you, because the more we can speak out, the better it is for everyone. and we ask for grace and understanding about our limitations. For example, during the pandemic, it's difficult for me to understand people who are wearing masks, and some people understand that and some people don't. So I ask for everyone to be compassionate and patient with all of us. So thank you for joining us today. We will share the recorded video on our YouTube channel. Please contact us with any questions or comments. We would love your feedback. The survey has been pasted in the chat, and I will also be sending one out in the link through Eventbrite. And again, your support is appreciated. If you liked what you heard today, and I also want to make a plug for a project we're working on. It's a podcast that has interviewed people with disabilities, particularly BIPOC with disabilities. And I interviewed Christiana and Kameko. So that should be rolled out in September. And if you like what you hear, please do donate to us. We really appreciate your support. And until next time, stay tuned. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Stay well.
Bye.